couple of weeks ago, I did a show on indifference, the philosophy espoused by the Stoics, indeed, probably even the core of Stoic philosophy. Stoic philosophy, like most philosophical systems, is a guide to living life, and in the case of Stoicism, in a very practical, reality-facing way. That's what appeals to so many people today in our modern era. Rather than emphasizing the abstract, the idealistic, and even the spiritual, whatever it may be that philosophies have tended to focus on, Stoicism is notable for its focus on a very practical guide to living in a very difficult world. And perhaps part of the reason for that is that Stoicism as we know it, which is a kind of the later version of ancient Stoicism, mostly comes to us via the teachings of a slave by the name of Epictetus and his eventual student, the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Aurelius's probable diary has had an enormous effect in the nearly 2,000 years since he wrote it. Generally, it's thought that he wrote it pretty much as notes for himself, but the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius has become one of the most influential books in Western philosophy and is considered one of the core texts of Roman Stoicism. We're going to have a check-in today on some of the key Stoic ideas that pertain to who we are right now in the situation we're in right now. And next week we'll look at a few basic Stoic practices that help us live our lives today. You know, anyone who studies philosophy or history or literature, whatever the case may be, often discovers that the ancient mind is pretty much our own mind. You know, we're exposed to that early in the Greek dramas and the Greek myths, and we recognize ourselves in these depictions of people that are thousands of years old. So when we look at, Roman philosophy from nearly 2,000 years ago, we are looking at a world which is not terribly unlike our own world. I think one of the first things that I want to share really shows that the concerns of people have never really changed either. And I want to read to you something that Marcus wrote about that in his famous Meditations. One of the main concerns of all of us, if we're really honest about it, is what other people think about us. And of course that concern is apparent throughout the history, the literature, the philosophy, etc. that I've referred to. It's no surprise that ancient Romans might have had exactly the same concerns, but it is refreshing to read the words of an ancient Roman to see that nothing has really changed in how silly it is to really be concerned about what other people think of you. This is what Marcus says on the subject. He says that someone who doesn't know that there is an ordered universe doesn't know where he is. Someone who doesn't know the natural purpose of the universe doesn't know who he is or what the universe is. Someone who fails in any one of these ways could not tell the purpose of his own existence either. So what do you think of the man who fears or courts the applause of an audience who have no idea of where they are or who they are? Do you want the praise of a man who curses himself 3 times an hour? Do you want to please a man who can't even please himself? It sounds very obvious, but there is this basic flaw in our idea that it's important what other people think of us. And the flaw is, what do we think gives them the qualification to think anything at all of us? Certainly they don't know much about themselves, and like most of us, don't really understand what the universe is all about. Chances are they don't understand much of anything, really, and chances are that just like us, they're full of flaws. They curse themselves, they regret doing things, they do things incorrectly, and yet we want to allow such a person to be our judge. It's that basic flaw that seems so obvious, but that perhaps Marcus was particularly sensitive to, because of course as Emperor of Rome, he's supposed to be a God figure, and yet he knows himself to be a weak and vulnerable and ordinary human being inside all of that. And he sees his critics, of course, and his worshippers, and as well as all the politics involved, and he understands that if I am to judge myself as a leader and as a human being, why I can't go by the standards of endlessly flawed human beings. In the end, I can only go by my own standards, because it's logical and obvious that others are not any more qualified to judge me than I or they are to judge the meaning of life and human experience. And ultimately, if the person who is your judge is someone who is as confused and flawed and vulnerably human as you, then logically it makes no sense to pay any importance to what they think about you. Another important topic to the philosophers and to many of our spiritual masters, East and West, ancient and modern, is the issue of attachment. Attachment perhaps is one of the greatest challenges we face as creatures of this world. And from a spiritual point of view, it is what traps us into the material world. It is what makes us believe that this is the only world or the most important world that we inhabit, or that ultimately it is by having what we want or getting what we want that we would be happy. All those great masters teach us that we must learn about detachment. Marcus himself simply said, receive things without pride and let go of them without attachment. Be humble in receiving, let go without attachment. And it's pretty straightforward. It says it all, but it's worth just noting the words of his teacher Epictetus. And basically what Epictetus said, that it is not only the desire for material things and the possession of stuff that traps us and subjugates us to the impulses, perhaps, of our more primitive self. He says it doesn't matter what the external thing is. It could be a desire for peace. It could be a desire for just some free time. It could be a desire to travel or to learn, which sound like great things. But Epictetus says, as many later great masters do, it doesn't matter what the external thing is. As soon as we place value on that external thing, we become subjugated to another, the society perhaps. Well, who gives it that value? Or once it has this value, we aspire to it, we own it, and suddenly we are subject to it, because what if we lose it? Even something as simple as a little bit of free time. The distress you might feel in losing free time is because of attachment to it, or attachment to the idea that you need it. Perhaps it might be even attachment to the work that you're seeking free time from, that is pulling you and pushing you and saying, okay, I'm going to let you off the hook for 5 minutes and get some free time. Everything in our lives is a great opportunity to kind of press our own buttons. And on the subject of attachment, that's a great one, because so many things challenge us because they seem good. And so we want to ask the question, how can it be bad to be attached to that? How can it be bad to be attached to the desire to learn? Because as soon as you attach to any desires, you're opening yourself up to disappointment. You are subjugated by that desire, and perhaps by others who hold the strings over it. For example, to learn, you might need access to a university or something like that. Anything which says your attachment makes you not free, and your attachment makes your mind not free. As Epictetus himself says it, where our heart is set, there our impediment lies. Epictetus reflects another remarkably modern characteristic in his discussion of attachment, and he points out that we attach to news. We attached to news from afar. It can't have been that easy to get the news in Roman times. We perhaps are even more attached to news than Epictetus could ever have imagined. And Epictetus points out that we attached to news about things that are far away from us. Think about it in modern times and watching the news on TV and worrying about what's going on in other countries and in other parts of the world. Says Epictetus, how can that bad news affect you in any way? How can it harm you? Why are you interested in news about where you are not? Isn't it enough to be unhappy about what's going on where you are? But you have to be unhappy by correspondence, says Epictetus smartly. Well, that kind of puts it in a nutshell. It says, focus on where you're at. Don't add unhappiness about things which you have no power over or indeed no actual relationship with. And it's similar to being attached to people and attached to loved ones. And you might think surely love is a good attachment, but we experience such pain and misery when those that we love depart as well. Epictetus reminds us, eventually someone will get sick. Eventually someone will die. Don't get upset at things which are natural, obvious, and predictable. It's not only attachment, that is. There's so many things which follow their natural course, and yet we get all freaked out. Don't get upset at things which are natural, obvious, and most importantly, predictable. We know that that's going to happen. So why are you upset as if you didn't know? In recent times, with the challenge of the coronavirus and the lockdown and all of that, we feel as if something's gone horribly wrong. There are other things in our lives which we think shouldn't be, and we wish that they weren't like that. But Marcus likes to point out that things are exactly as they should be. Often when we say something like that, we're proposing some mysterious or spiritual force behind that. And if you think about it too hard, it's a little bit difficult to accept. And sometimes it's exactly how it's supposed to be, sounds as a platitude that avoids a difficult truth, or is really just a way of dealing with something difficult, but without really addressing what the problem may be. For me especially, I think I've got a lot of difficulty with the glib, things are exactly how they're supposed to be, because I want to ask, supposed by who, or by what, or for what? Marcus explains it a little bit more clearly, and in a way that is pertinent to now, because one of the things that we have been most challenged by in this crisis is what it means that we're all in this together. For once, the world was experiencing something together. The humans were experiencing something together. And one of the things that I think we were challenged to learn or remember is that we are part of a collective. It isn't just about ourselves, but we live in a world of such emphasized individuality, and we place such importance on the belief that individual rights trump all other rights, that we've forgotten this kind of collective experience as human beings that also applies to us. This is what Marcus says. He says, whether atoms or natural order, the first premise must be that I am part of the whole which is governed by nature. And the second, that I must have some close relationship with the other kindred parts. With these premises in mind, insofar as I am a part, I shall not resent anything assigned by the whole. Nothing which benefits the whole can be harmful to the part, and the whole contains nothing which is not to its benefit. All organic natures have this in common, but the nature of the universe has this additional attribute, that no external cause can force it to create anything harmful to itself. So, remembering that I am part of a whole so constituted will leave me happy with all that happens to me. And insofar as I have some close relationship with the other kindred parts, I shall do nothing unsocial, but rather look to the good of my kin and have every impulse directed to the common benefit and diverted from its opposite. I recently did a show on the common good based on Stoic ideas as well, and he makes the point that when you look at the common, and when you get away from the individual and look at the whole, it's clearly as it should be, not necessarily intended by anything except nature, as in because that's how it is. And so as a whole, it cannot be affected by things outside of it. As a whole, all the parts must serve the whole. And if I'm a part, I must presume I'm serving the whole. And I must presume then this is exactly how it's supposed to be, because this is how the whole works. That's what supposes it. And so I must assume that there is no personal harm to me out of something that is good for the whole, because what's good for me is good for the whole. And so it encourages us to understand that acting for the common good is a way to benefit ourselves because we're part of the common good ourselves. It's really as simple as that. Whereas acting selfishly denies the reality of things, i.e., that we are part of a greater species, planet, etc., and therefore causes us pain, feelings of separation, feelings of victimization, feelings of disconnection, feelings of having to live up to or having to please. So many of the things which cause us pain and restlessness occur because we fail to understand that the whole acts in its own interest, and my interest is the whole's interest because I'm part of the whole. Maybe we need to remember that when we kick and scream and complain and demand individual rights in the face of what's good for everyone. So much of our pain and grief is caused essentially by unsettling ourselves, the harm that we do to ourselves. Everything that we've discussed so far is very much about creating restlessness in our own minds that makes us disturbed and unhappy in some way. Marcus addresses the problem of the harm we do ourselves. I'm going to paraphrase him a little as I go to make this clearer. But basically, he says there are 5 ways that we harm ourselves. Firstly, when we consider ourselves separate to the universe. Because if we are separate to the universe, it's like then we are a cancer that grows on the universe, a tumor. And he says, because if you resent anything that happens to yourself, then you are separating yourself from nature, and therefore you are against nature. You are in revolt of nature. So, resenting anything that happens to oneself is one of the harms we do to ourselves. Secondly, when we turn away from others or harm others, such as when we're in anger. Of course, if we're all part of a whole, when we harm others, we harm ourselves. And thirdly, he says, when we give in to pleasure or pain, we harm ourselves. Fourthly, whenever we lie or perpetrate anything that's fake or false, we harm ourselves. And fifthly, when we act randomly rather than with some kind of intention, because he says even the most trivial action should be undertaken with reference to where does it end? What is the intention at the end? And he says the end for rational creatures such as ourselves is to follow the reason and the rule of that most venerable archetype of a governing state, the universe. It's not the state, it's not ourselves, it's the universe or the whole or the collective. He uses that word universe, which is very familiar to the modern mind. And he says if you are functioning in attune with that, then everything you do has purpose and you don't harm yourself. Ultimately, bottom line of what he's saying there is that when you don't act selfishly, you don't cause harm. A last lesson I want to raise from Marcus is one that is also one that many of the great masters teach us, and we struggle so hard to fulfill, even though we instinctively know the truth of it, and that is the importance of living in the present. The Stoics are very big on don't worry about what you're not in control of. And certainly you're not in control of the future. You're not in control of what will happen. So that is one reason. But here is our friend Marcus and how he articulates it. He says, even if you are destined to live 3,000 years, or 10 times that long, nevertheless remember that no one loses any life other than the one he lives, or lives any life other than the one he loses. It follows that the longest and the shortest lives are brought together to the same state. The present moment is equal for all. So what is passing is equal also. The loss, therefore, turns out to be the merest fragment of time. No one can lose either the past or the future. How can you be deprived of what you don't possess? So always remember these two things. First, that all things have been of the same kind since time everlasting, coming round and round again. It makes no difference whether one will see the same things for 100 years or 200 years or for an infinity of time. Second, that both the longest lived and the shortest lived suffer the same loss, to die. It is only the present moment of which either stands to be deprived. And indeed, if this is all you have, then you can't lose what you don't have, the future. So you don't know about the future. You don't have the past, it's gone. All you have is the present moment. It is the one thing you cannot lose. So it's irrelevant whether you should live for thousands of years or not. You don't have those things yet. Only the present exists. We can only live in the present. And it's a great equalizer, because whether your actual lifespan is 3,000 years or 70 years, the only thing you have is the present. The person who is of a species that lives 3,000 years doesn't have anything more than you have, because all you have is the present, and that one could be dead tomorrow just like you could, whether or not that's their lifespan. There isn't really such a thing as a lifespan. It's a hypothetical and it's a possible. The only thing you can be absolutely sure that you do have is this moment right now. And so that is the thing that liberates you from having to worry about what happens in the future and what happened in the past. So there's a lot to unpack in that thought, but it is very liberating when you boil it down to the simple fact of the only thing you actually have is this moment. You don't have time, you don't have other people, you don't have moments of free time or moments where you're supposed to be working. You don't have these things. The only thing you have is the present. That's the thing that you should be focusing on. And if you think about it, if it is so that that's the only thing that you have, then focusing on that will make you as powerful as it is possible to be, because you are in possession of everything that is truly yours. Next week, some basic practices you can use to get onto that Stoic path. I'll be here at the usual time. See you.